Hi everyone, I'm really excited to interview Neil Leach, an architect and interdisciplinary scholar. Besides teaching at FIU, he is currently visiting professor at Harvard GST and Tongji University, and professor at the European Graduate School, NASA Innovative Advanced Concept Fellow, and an academician of the Academia Europaea. I was very fortunate to be part of Digital Futures Conference, and to be honest, that totally changed my career trajectory, and I got involved more into AI after that point. So in this interview, you will get to know about Neil's journey, his research work, thoughts on applications of AI, along with some advice to engineers and students who wish to do similar work. Neil, can you tell us about your background, where you grew up, and out of all things you can do in life, why you chose architecture?
Oh, well, my background, I mean, I guess I would say it was nomadic. It wasn't my fault. My father was in the British forces, and I was brought up in Hong Kong and then back in the UK, then in Germany. And but I've been nomadic also in terms of how I've continued. I mean, I've been teaching in many different countries. I'm now in the States physically, in California, but I also teach in China and elsewhere. And also, I've kind of been nomadic in terms of my discipline. I mean, I guess when you go to university, you choose something without knowing what it's going to be. And I was good at maths and art. I was very good at art, actually. And so I chose architecture because I didn't think art was going to be a profession. And I had a background in Latin and Greek. And I guess what was interesting about Latin and Greek, it was those days, it was kind of cultural studies. We were studying philosophy, and I was interested in the philosophy side of things. Anyway, I went to university, and I would say there were some aspects of architecture that eventually I mean, I think architectural practice I found a little tedious. And I've always been interested in by the kind of the ideas behind architecture. And although I've been on an architectural platform, I've always been sort of looking at other places. Initially, my first thing I did after I finished at Cambridge was a translation of Alberti from Latin into English. And then I got involved, worked in office. Then I became an academic, and I started looking around at the university where I was, which was University of Nottingham, for the kind of the hottest ideas on campus. And they had a very progressive school of critical theory. So I teamed up with them, and they were talking about Deleuze and Derrida and those things in those days. And that was my initial area really of research after Alberti, was to look in the critical theory and to find new tools, in a way, intellectual tools to open up ideas about architecture. So I published a book called Rethinking Architecture in 1997, and that was about how you used ideas from other disciplines to as a way of kind of just destabilizing accepted ways of doing things in architecture and challenging the status quo. And then, as a result of that, I got invited to different schools to go and teach. Bernard Schumi invited me to Columbia. Then I went to go and teach at the AA and a series of other kind of well-known schools. And I realized that what I was interested in design terms within the new kind of computational sort of world. And my theoretical interest in philosophy, I tried to realign it towards a theory of the digital, and that took some time, I must say, because there's not so much you can say about some things, in terms of robotic arm. What do you say about a robotic arm? It's kind of doing whatever it's doing. Maybe you can apply a theory of cyborg to it or something. And it's only been recently since I came across AI that I've really been able to kind of get caught in a kind of wrapped up in a kind of theoretical agenda, because it's deeply philosophical, because you deal with questions of consciousness and so on. So I guess I'd say it's been a kind of nomadic journey. But actually, at the very beginning when I was working in Alberti, there was something there that I think began to sort of trigger things off, because I wasn't designing at the time on computers, but I was typing it all up, as it were, onto a computer. And the days we were staying, I was working with the mainframe computer at the University of Cambridge. Of course, it's very famous. Alan Turing was there, and Charles Babbage was there. And in fact, I was in the computer science department, surrounded by these incredible geeks who were doing incredible things. And I was above the Babbage Lecture Theatre. And at that time, I could see there was a glimpse of some kind of potential, because while I was translating, I realized that previous to that, you had typewriters, and you just couldn't afford to type it more than once, really. You Tipex it, but this time you could revise it and revise it and revise it. So something new came out. It wasn't about style, it was about method, it was about process. And I glimpsed then that the computer was really about processes, and it was something else. So in a sense, the seed of something was at the very beginning of that kind of journey. And now, in a kind of strange way, I'm kind of realized that seed has kind of has taken root in some way. So it's I think when you're at school, you choose a university discipline. You don't necessarily know what it's going to be like. Maybe now I'd be interested in neuroscience or AI. I don't know, but no, I'm glad that this kind of revolution's happened in AI, because I think it's one of the best things that's happened to architecture in recent years, and it's really, I think, stimulating a lot of creativity, and also I think it's stimulating a lot of intellectual debates or theoretical debates. Yeah.
I see. And like it's interesting that like how your environment influences someone's thought. So I'm curious, like during your formative years, which philosopher did you resonated most?
I would say Derrida, partly because he was a rock star in the 90s. I mean, incredible. I mean, we'd have kind of Pavarotti singing in the park, and it would be thousands of people going. And Derrida was speaking, it would be absolutely packed. And now the strange thing about Derrida is that, in a way, that some of the ideas he was talking about have been made very explicit through AI. So he had this idea that, well, maybe I can just go back for a moment. When I was young, I because I was traveling around a lot in different cultures. At about the age of 10, there was a very important moment for me when I was watching a football match, a soccer match, between England and Germany. And we were living in Germany. There was only terrestrial TV in those days, so we had to kind of have the radio on. So we were listening to the radio in English and the television in German. And it was interesting because at that point, I began to realize that there are different ways of interpreting reality. There was one moment when one of the British forwards, the David Beckham of the time, I guess, took a shot at goal. The German goalkeeper saved it, and I had two different accounts. The British commentator was saying, "Oh, unlucky," and the German commentator was saying, obviously in German, "Fantastic save." So I thought, this is really interesting. You can see the world from different perspectives. So I began to realize that the world was kind of constructed in a certain way. We were taught to believe in certain things, and I think that's what Derrida was talking about. I mean, deconstruction was nothing about architectural form. It was about how our ideas were constructed in a certain way, and with certain, let's call them biases. That's the way it goes. I mean, male is privileged over female, practice over theory, and so on. And what I find interesting now is that we find ourselves with AI coming across the same things. I mean, everyone says that AI is biased. Well, it's only biased. Well, it's not only biased, but it's biased primarily because we are biased. So I think in some ways, Derrida's sort of discussions are really becoming very relevant now. And I think what he would say was, there's an architecture of architecture, by which he meant there's a constructed way by which we look at construction. And I think that's very true. So he was always interested in challenging previous assumptions, and calling them into question, and asking, why are you saying these things? And I think that's exactly really what we're getting with AI. You're challenging received ways of looking at architecture, and calling them to question. So I think that idea of questioning things, problematizing things, is really important in order to keep architecture alive. If you just accept what's happening, it's somehow dead. But if you're questioning it continually, then it's a kind of alive. So from that perspective, I think, last week we had Wolf Pricks talking about this, and I think he can see that connection. And Wolf is kind of strange because he claims not to be theoretical at all, but he is very theoretical, and I could see, and his understanding of Derrida is actually quite correct. And he can see that what was happening in those days, and with deconstruction, is similar to what's happening now with AI. There's a kind of a sudden kind of creative impulse that is been challenging things. And I think back in the 80s, when deconstruction was so hot, we were stuck in postmodernism, which I think was a real crisis for architecture and culture as a whole. And that kind of burst of critical inquiry produced some incredibly interesting thinking and some incredibly interesting architecture. I mean, I think a lot of these architects we have around today, who've been quite famous, from Zaha to Rem to Gehry to whatever, they were based on questioning traditions, and not accepting things, but really. So yeah, I'd say Derrida is the most important, but at the same time, Deleuze was also an interesting kind of figure out there. But I would say Derrida was, to me, the most important one.
I see. And like were there like moments when you started reading more about the philosophy, the time just went by and it was like hours and hours spent, and you got some revelation the more you read?
Actually, to be honest, most of these philosophers, you need someone to explain them to you because I mean, without that, a secondary source, it's not so easy to follow. I mean, Freud, for example, is so much easier to digest if you have someone giving a lecture about it than going through the entire works of Freud. So, but what I was doing, when I was at Nottingham, I was sitting in a master's course in critical theory, and we had a series of lectures about this. And then I set up a course in architecture called Architecture and Critical Theory, where we were on a Tuesday night, we'd have critical theorists and philosophers talking about these things, and then on a Thursday evening we'd say, well, what's the relevance for architecture? So after 5 or 6 years of that, I think understood some of the ideas quite well. But it's no, I wouldn't say it's easy. Some of that stuff, it's very challenging. But and I think frankly, we're in architecture a bit lazy. We don't really have much. If you look at something like Learning from Las Vegas, it's completely vacuous. You compare that to Adorno or someone like that, it's yeah. Yeah.
I
No,
see.
but I think maybe the other person now I think who is I think really relevant is Slavoj Žižek. I would say because he makes it accessible, and he always has been trying to do that, and he makes it fun and he makes it relevant. So he's great. But increasingly now, just to sort of add to that, I mean, I think that the paradigm has shifted a little bit from the old days. It was kind of philosophy and critical theory, comparative literature. Now, increasingly, it's what's called cognitive science. It's neuroscience and AI. It's if we have philosophy, it's people like Andy Clark, and I think that we have neuroscientists like Anil Seth who are really fascinating, who are really opening up questions now in a really important way. But it's a very vibrant area. So there are all ideas coming in the whole time, and it's important to keep track of them.
I see. And if you have just three words to describe your philosophy, what are those three?
3 words. Oh, I'm not sure. I have 3 words. Was that it? Was it's sort of you're describing it, whereas I think it's actually really a question of kind of processes, about interrogation and things like that. It's not about adjectives so much as kind of processes. But I think the yeah, I would say that the important thing is really to ask questions, to challenge, to ask questions the whole time. Why are you doing this? So I wouldn't, it's not a question of description, but more a kind of interrogation, I'd say. Yeah.
I see. And during your journey till date, what was the most challenging part where there was struggle compared to other things?
Most challenging. Well, I mean, I think life should be continually challenging, right? I mean, if it's too easy, it's no. I don't think there's been any particular kind of crisis. I mean, I think when you embark on something new, you always encounter resistance. I mean, I think that's perpetually the case. There's been resistance to all innovations, whether intellectual innovations or technical innovations throughout history. When I was a student at Cambridge, for example, there was incredible opposition to the computer. We weren't allowed to use a computer in the drawings in the studio. And as a result, a whole generation of students became unemployable because of that. I mean, so those are the things, and I've always encountered opposition from people when you start questioning and challenging things in a critical way. But that was the kind of the style at the AA, definitely. Really asking tough questions. It wasn't a kind of a school of kind of stylistics or things, and it was really an interesting, vibrant culture of interrogation. And when I was teaching there, we had incredible people actually were studying there. If I look at it now, I mean, Akim Menges was there, Neri Oxman was there, and then Claudia Pasquero was there. A series of really interesting individuals, and yeah. So yeah, I think it's important to question and challenge assumptions the whole time.
Is there anything you wish you would have done differently?
I think that I maybe would have wished I'd known more about what the profession of architecture was like, which, I think you come out of college and you gradually build up a certain kind of confidence, shall we say. You start off doing a house in your first year of school, in your second year. By the time you get to your final year, you're designing an entire city or something, and then you go and work in office, and you're put in charge of designing the toilets or the door handles or something. I think that I guess if I mean I think that I mean it depends what you call architecture, because I think there are many interesting things happening in the discipline of architecture and academia that are really very stimulating. My impression of practice was it was kind of very straightforward and not challenging in many ways. So maybe if I'd realized that earlier on, I wouldn't have had. I would maybe have not worried about certain things. Don't think I would have worried about qualifying as an architect, getting registered, and so on. But you find out these things on the journey, and it's you can't necessarily predict these things. But yeah, I mean, my definition of architecture though is very different. I mean, I don't think it's. I've always years ago someone asked me how did I find architecture, and I said it's less a question of the construction of buildings as an imagining a better future world. And I think there is something about that architectural imagination that is very special. I think what we learn to kind of design, to think three-dimensionally, to understand material behavior is something. These are skills that can be deployed in other arenas, and it's interesting to me that some of the ADs I've been looking at, for example, about space architecture or 3D printed body architecture, it's been the architects who've been doing these things because they have these skill sets. So, I think that to my mind, to be an architect is really to have a certain imagination, a certain way of thinking about the world. And, when it comes to sort of putting together something like digital futures, which was, that required a certain kind of logistical imagination to do, or indeed setting up a DDES and things, that's also a form of design. It's also, to my mind, a form of architecture. So I think that the notion of architecture is really about, it's a much more wider, broader thing than we have in the profession. It's about something about using that imagination in a kind of creative way to think about possible new openings. So, well, maybe I'm not disappointed I did architecture. I'm glad that at a certain point I realized that maybe there are other ways of being an architect. I think there what someone has called other architectures. There are other ways in which you can become an architect. And I suspect also that actually, frankly, working with AI, because they use the term architecture right in computer science, I kind of think that that's actually not so far either from what it is to be an architect. So
And like as you said, you were involved in digital futures. You do teaching at FIU. You're involved like in as an author. Like you do so many activities. So like, how does a day of your life look like?
uh, my day is constrained by time zones because I'm right now I can't say what, but we're discussing a lot with Philip Yan in Shanghai about a new venture. You'll hear it next week, and they have a different time clock. They're going to bed when I'm waking up. And in fact, one thing we discovered for Digital Futures, I don't know if you know the emblem of Digital Futures is kind of like these three crescents inside each other, nested inside each other. That's actually a study of the time zones. And what we discovered was there was only one particular slot in the day, which is 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 6 a.m. my time, West Coast, Pacific Standard Time, 10 o'clock in China, and 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Central Europe, 10 o'clock at night in China. And that was the one time slot we found when most of the kind of time zones overlapped. Doesn't work for New Zealand and Australia and Japan and Korea so well, but otherwise it does. So that means I'm up at that time in the morning. I'm up half an hour before that. It's 5:30. Several days a week. So that's the challenge. And but that's okay. That's okay. And we have the Doctor of Design program. We have students in Australia. We have students in China. And so we often have classes first thing. But no, I think it's really a question of trying to how do you squeeze out as much of the day out of yourself during the day as you can. It's a challenge. And yeah, I'm fortunate that I'm on Venice Beach, which is a great place to be in a pandemic because it's there's a beautiful ocean out there, and I normally try and go surfing once a day just to get out there and experience the ocean. But it's a question of really how do you kind of make the most of your day. But it's intense. It's intense. I mean, yeah. But I know I believe in production, and I believe in somehow in doing books and getting it out there and spreading the message. I think that's what has been the beauty about digital futures is that suddenly we realized last year that we could use this platform and reach out to the rest of the world, and we could reach out for free. And that's really been a kind of game changer to my mind. So all the teaching that we do, Doctor of Design program at FIU, when I say at FIU, I'm in California, FIU's in Miami. All of that is we live stream that, and that's really a kind of central part of the program. I'm going on to a different subject now, but yeah.
I see. And like you showed us like the new way of like collaborative learning, organizing conference, teaching, which is quite, I would say, forefront in leading the way we teach architecture.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I just go back just to that moment when we thought about Digital Futures World. Digital Futures was itself a kind of, it started in 2011 when I was teaching at USC, and we came across to go and do a workshop for the American Academy in China and went to Shanghai. And then we kind of built up over that. But last year was kind of crucial because in February we could see that, the pandemic was set in and there was no way we could do it. So we just canceled it. We said, okay, we can't do it. We canceled it. But then in April, I had my review, and I invited Philip Yuan, and I invited Wan Yuhe in China, and I invited Gilles Retzin in London to come to the review. And you thought, well, I couldn't have done this before. I couldn't have done this before. And then a week later, Matthias Del Campo invited him to me to his review, and he had 1,000 people, following it. And so suddenly I thought to myself, well, this is crazy. Actually, it's not a hindrance. We can actually do things we never did before. Now, the cheeky thing was we got persuaded everyone to go and contribute for free. And that I think is a game changer now, because I think we've now realized that the kind of the model in the past is no longer the case, that people are kind of quite happy to join in for free. So anyway, the Digital Futures World was a big success. I mean, some were skeptical, but it really ended up being exactly what we imagined. In fact, even better, I would say. I think the standard of the workshops, every single workshop leader was telling us this is an amazing standard. It's really fantastic. And we didn't have any disasters. I mean, that's not to say we won't have any disasters in the future, but we didn't have any disasters. And then after we finished, there was a group who were attending my theory workshop. I did one with Sanford Quinto, Antoine Picon, and Marika Trotter, and they said, let's carry on discussing things. So they set up a Discord channel. And then we thought, we got a Discord channel, but what's the Discord channel for? And we thought, well, okay, why don't we just keep the platform open? And so things kind of evolved actually in a way, not in a premeditated way, but just more kind of like you could see the opportunity or the affordance of this situation, and we kind of refined it and refined it and refined it in a very kind of bottom up way, and something emerged. And initially, that platform was going to be about just about we call Digital Futures Young, just about the scholars, and showing their work, because we hadn't done that in the Digital Future session, whereas we had before when we had a physical one. But then we began to realize that actually what really this platform was really good at was bringing people together in a different sort of way, and creating discussion. So that was incredible. But then more recently, one thing I've discovered is that on the DDES slot that we're doing, which we're really experimenting with what it can be, what can an educational platform be, we discovered two things. One, that there's a kind of brain in operation. When you've got a bunch of people who are really some of the leaders in the field, there's an immediate feedback and a kind of a very intense creative process going on that I could never seen before. I mean, it's possible before to have that, but you didn't get people together on the same platform. And so you had this kind of global brain, which is astonishing, really amazing, the kind of creative thinking going on. I mean, I come out just blown away every after every session. But the other thing was that people wanted to be part of this, And Matthias Del Campo, he said after the first one, "Why didn't you invite me?" Actually, I had invited him. He hadn't checked his WeChat, but yeah. So in a way, everyone wants to be part of this, which is great, and we have this discussion going, and it really is fabulous. And we can extend this, we can live stream this, and make it accessible to people around the world. So that's been a real kind of revelation in a way, and we want to kind of push that further. I think that so there's one of the paradigm shifts that's happened is that in the old days you had to pay people thousands of dollars to give a lecture, and now people are kind of volunteering. It's easier for them just to come and log on and do this, and that's fantastic. It means that people in India or other countries around the world can learn about these things. Otherwise, they wouldn't have access to. And I strongly feel that education is a right, not a privilege. And it's great to be able to spread this information to people around the world who otherwise could not afford it. So this is kind of evolving as we're going, and now we're talking about the possibility of how we can use this platform to kind of share teaching in a way, so make it an official platform, because it doesn't make any sense anymore to have one professor in one classroom talking to a group of students. You might as well join forces, and then you can make the most of everything. You could get Akim Menges to teach on one subject and someone else another subject, and so on. So that's what we're exploring at the moment, how we could do this at a doctoral level. But no, I think it's important to be kind of alert to these possibilities and to really make the most of them, because I think we're in a new world now. I think AI and COVID have changed everything, and we have to think, we have to be architects in a sense to be able to imagine the way that we can operate in that sort of world. So it's been a revelation in many ways, but it just requires you to kind of be receptive to new ideas and critical, or not just complacent and just accepting the past as the past, but always continually rethinking things. So I guess that word, one of the words would be rethinking, even the three words. But yeah, so yeah, I mean, it's interesting how we're doing things. And one of the most, and I've often said this, but one of the most important times in my career was when I was teaching in Dessau in Germany, where the Bauhaus is, and it's free, almost free there. And we got the most incredible students there. I mean, they'd been offered places at the top schools, the AA and so on. They couldn't afford to go there. So, but they could afford to go to Dessau. And I discovered that really that, and it was a surprise in some ways, but well, it was obvious. But the top 2% in any country are really very good. And we had some really fantastic students from Bangladesh there and from all over the place, not from the wealthy countries, but from the less privileged countries. So I guess that's also been at the back of my mind, in setting up digital futures. How do you reach out to those people? And also not just simply reaching out and passing on the information, but trying to kind of get information from them. So those haven't been our most popular sessions, but I really liked the session we had with Bangladesh, for example. There's very smart kids there who are telling us how they operate, how they think. And reaching out to Egypt, for example, that was really another interesting session to see how they, do things like, rammed earth construction in Egypt. So I just think the moment we're kind of, there's a whole new horizon out there that's opened up. It's a bit like the Wild West, and it's a question of how you make the most of it. So we're kind of pushing forward in a new way. And I think it's a complete new paradigm. I'm hoping that it'll spread everywhere, that we'll be able to get beyond this kind of corporate mentality where the West is always the center of things and see the world in terms of a network, and we'll overcome those divisions. I mean, I think that's the thing that I find most encouraging. So yeah, yeah. So one of the things I would say is out of what's happening now, it's interesting. When I was teaching at the AA, I got paid peanuts. Actually, I didn't pay very well, but it didn't matter. I loved it. And actually, my motto for life is almost like you can have a job you don't want to do, and it doesn't matter how much you're going to be paid, you're not going to enjoy it. And you can have a job that you do want to do. It doesn't matter how much you're not paid, you still want to do it. And I think that's the way that things happen, and increasingly. And I do this when I go out surfing. In most days, no one pays me to go out surfing, but I want to go out there. So I think if we can transform this model that we have, where people have to be paid a lot to do something, to do that, really they're doing things that they enjoy doing, then we can overturn some of these things and maybe make access to other people, educational ideas, more accessible to other people. So that's the kind of thing that I find really refreshing about this situation, is we can spread knowledge for free and bring it to other people. So yeah.
I see. And for some reason, when you were describing these moments, I felt like such as Bauhaus was a moment in architecture history. Maybe this can be referred to future as one critical turn of how things were taught in school.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, actually, I often think about the Bauhaus. I mean, it was a very small school, and it was only there for, I don't know, 6, 7 years. I forget, no, maybe longer. I mean, you think about it. Actually, what the more significant school was the one that came afterwards, the what's called DIA in a way, because there are about 200 students there, right? And it's been going on for about, I don't know, 15 years or so. I was there at the very beginnings, 17, 18 years, and that's significant. So I think there are all sorts of things opening up in a way. And yeah, but certainly I think it's interesting how it's something's evolving out of the situation. And I do think it's a watershed moment. I do think it's a moment when we can share knowledge. And, I'm really grateful for all those tutors last summer who kind of took up the challenge, to it was a form of solidarity for towards the rest of the architectural community, who were in some ways, in very many ways, in a form of distress. But maybe we could continue that. Maybe we could continue to kind of share that generosity. I think that, especially, I think the Western world owes it to the rest of the world. When we have our coffee or tea or something, someone's been paid very little money to produce that, and we should maybe kind of share things a bit more. My first post was at the University of Nottingham, which is, of course, where Robin Hood was. So I kind of believe that idea that somehow sort of robbing from the rich to give to the poor. So I think I'm hoping that we're going to have a more kind of inclusive future in architecture. That's really, and you might hear that word inclusive in the next few weeks more often for different reasons. I'll explain next week. But we're really interested in the possibility of trying to get beyond this kind of a world which is based on people having money and people not having money, to try and bring others on board. And that's not a necessarily, I mean, it's just kind of fair thinking. And I think once we've been through some of the social upheavals of last year, Black Lives Matter, which I think, to my mind, was really quite a broad moment when we began to sort of realize that we have to change the way we operate. I'm looking forward to seeing how life can be more inclusive, and especially architectural education. So I don't know, but I think it is a watershed moment. Yeah, I hope so. Anyway, how we can make it work financially is another kind of question, but at the moment we're relying on people's generosity, and it seems to be working quite well. But I know I mean when you set these things up, when you start off with something, you always start with something very small, right? And the first year of Digital Futures, before we even called it Digital Futures, we had about, I don't know, I brought, I think, 12 students to China, and there were maybe 12 of them there, and it was small. But gradually, we had 12,000 applicants last summer, and we get regularly now getting, I don't know, 6,000 people watching every Saturday in Digital Futures and so on. So that's how things grow. I think they grow incrementally, and not through a sudden revolution, but you plant the seed of something, and it evolves into something very special. So we'll see. I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm very hopeful. I think we've hopefully broken through some of these old protocols to make life more accessible. And I think, for example, in India, I assume you're from India, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you know, there are kids there who really, I mean, super smart, right? I'm waiting for this computational revolution to come from India, which is kind of strange because India is fantastic for computation, especially for AI. But for some reason, schools of architecture are completely not computational there. But I think these ideas are the kind of things that actually that India could particularly latch onto, Indian students particularly latch onto, and it'd be great to see it actually, because yeah, there were some fantastic computational people that I've come across from India. Sajid Bhushan being one example. Actually, a lot of Indians go to this. So let's see.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like if you see a lot of Indians go to US and they are working in Silicon Valley and bringing some our frontier in some tech revolution. So there are opportunities, and hopefully like moments like digital futures give that push and they get voice.
Yeah, I also think that no, I think politically also I'm hoping anyway in the states. I find the states a little conservative, but when Kamala Harris is the vice president, that is a really important moment actually when you think about it. She's female. Her father's from like Jamaica, and her mother's from India. That's the new world, right? And it's good, to lose the old world, and to embrace a new paradigm. So that yeah, I think I'm hoping that the future of architecture is going to be way more inclusive from that point of view.
Yeah, and one thing which I realized through this global sharing of knowledge, earlier there were like few architecture schools which had access to technology like fabrication, which rest of the world didn't have, and they had some advantage, like in some manner. But now, since it's getting more accessible through internet and everyone can now access resources on cloud, I hope the gap between those polarity is reducing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, and I think it is. I mean, it is. Yeah, I think. I mean, even now we can. There are ways in which you can operate remotely using robotics and things. So you don't necessarily have to have it yourself. So I'm hoping so too. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to know your thoughts on like what is one thing about AI in architecture which you are hopeful about and one thing you are worried about.
So just to say, I've just finished a manuscript of one book, and it's going to take till October to come out. It's a bit frustrating, but it'll be out of date by the time it comes out. Excuse me. But that's about the positive side of AI, right? And it's got a white cover like an angel. But my next book is going to be has got a black cover like the devil, and it's about the dark side of AI. Now, I don't think that AI. So first of all, I think AI has got incredible potential. We might not even recognize it. I think that one of the most important things was the famous game of AlphaGo versus Lee Sedol. This move 37, where they were scratching their heads thinking this is a mistake. It was actually strategically a brilliant move, and we just didn't see it. I mean, and Alan Turing had already said, that he predicted that computers would be able to compose sonnets, but the problem is that human beings wouldn't be able to appreciate them. So I think, in a way, it's incredible what we're going to see. I mean, computers operate slightly differently to how we operate on the whole, but their capacity is astonishing. And I use WeChat, and the language app, the translation app from Chinese to English is amazing. It's getting better by the day. So that's for sure. And certainly, I think in terms of the kind of the material that my students are generating, we've been working with Daniel Bolojan, who is unbelievably good, by the way. And we've been working on that, and they're just blown away by the possibilities of this new world. They really believe in it. I'm not sure how my colleagues take it, but the students believe it. So I think the possibilities are astonishing what it can do. There's no question. And I've seen my students get so excited when they're working on GANs. They produce their first thing, and they realize it's kind of not that mysterious, and they can do it themselves, and so on and so on. So there's no question. And obviously with time, gradually they'll be able to kind of work away at some of the outstanding issues. The problem, we're not only working two-dimensionally largely, and we can't, all these other issues, we can't control the process and so on. Soon it'll happen, and soon we'll be able to get AI being able to generate buildings. I'm convinced by the end of this decade, I've said in my book. So I've said that basically AI will be able to produce a building. It'll know what we want, and it'll produce it, just like it can tell us through Spotify what music we like and so on, and it will do it. And that is the most incredible thing. It'll be, no question. And with Moore's law, whatever you call it, basically this is going to speed up. And I'm convinced by the end of the decade, before 2030, we will have that capacity. Now that's amazing. That's amazing. Now that is, of course, also terrifying. And that's the point about the dark side of AI. It's not that it's. I know that Stuart Russell have warned us, other people have warned us about the dangers of AI, that it can be used for weapons. Of course it can, but so can a kitchen knife. I mean, you cut your vegetables with a kitchen knife, or you murder someone. So it's not, you can't blame the tool. So it has that potential. And of course, in terms of surveillance too, it could be used in a very negative way. But I'm not concerned about that, because I it's really a question of who's doing what. It's more, what I find about AI is that it's so good that it's terrifyingly good. And when I'm talking about this in my lectures, I normally point to one particular moment, which was a kind of wake-up call for me when I was boarding a plane, and I had my boarding pass out, and the flight attendant said, "I don't need that, just look at this screen," and it recognized me. And at that moment, I thought, how does it recognize me from everyone else in the world? And so that's my point in a way. It's terrifyingly good. And what is going to happen? What is obviously going to happen is that the architectural profession will be completely overhauled. My second book is called The Death of the Architect. Now that's partly, I think the architecture as a profession is struggling for other reasons. I mean, to do with the way that, let's say, design, build, and other sort of strategies have taken place. So the architect's no longer in control. That's already happening. But what's going to happen very soon, and it's already happening in some ways in other sense of computation, is that we don't need so many architects in the office. Maybe that's a good thing. I mean, Tom Main's saying, great, I can only have 12 people and I can get to know them really well rather than 80 people I don't know. But it's going to mean that things are going to change. And so in a sense, that's in a way, well, the negative side of AI is potentially that, but it's going to happen to every single profession pretty much. People think that architects are immune because they're creative. I don't think so. I don't think that human beings are so creative. And in any case, it's not a one-for-one thing, you versus AI. It's basically AI being used as a form of extended intelligence. Therefore, you don't need so many people in the office, and so on and so on and so on. So that's the challenge. And I don't know what the answer is, but I think as educators, we have an obligation to warn our students about these things. And and I think the real problem about education is that, I'm not pointing at anyone in particular, but I think there are a lot of out of touch professors around who maybe studied Le Corbusier 30, 40 years ago and are still teaching the same thing. I always make this joke about this, always tell this story about this professor who, used to have a packed audience when he was first giving his lectures. And then towards the end of his career, there are only 6 people there. And he says, I don't understand it. I'm giving exactly the same lectures. The point is that actually we have to update ourselves and revise ourselves and so on. And the world is really changing rapidly. And but the problem is, as educators, we're dealing with students, from your generation, frankly, who are going to be at the peak of their careers when this really kicks in. So we have an obligation to warn people and prepare people for that age. So in a way, it's not necessarily a negative thing. It's how the society is evolving, but we have to be aware of that and take charge. So yeah, but the negative sides of anything, I'm very much against this idea of the concept of technological determinism, which is to say something is bad in and of itself. No, it's not. A kitchen knife is not bad. You could use it for vegetables, or you could murder someone. And I think we have to be in mind about that AI. So my next book then is going to be not focusing on the surveillance questions or the kind of the drones that can kill you, which of course I'm sure they can, but it's going to be focusing on how terrifyingly good AI is, and we have to recognize that. Yeah.
I see. And like whenever like you were sharing thoughts, I could sense like rethinking, adapting, questioning the why, like as the core theme which a lot of your thoughts are evolving. So it's quite good to know.
Well, let me just say one thing: is that one of my books was called Camouflage, and it's all about adaptation. Unfortunately, that was a book that, I mean, I really love that book, but it's not, most architects can't understand it. I think it's straightforward, but anyway, but no, adaptation is absolutely part of it. I think we have to adapt to survive. That's yeah.
I see.
So.
And to all our listeners who are interested in such kind of AI, architecture, philosophy, digital innovation, and to all young Neil Leach, what is your advice?
I think over and above what I've been talking about now, I think we're in a moment where we can actually understand what it is to be human. I've long had this idea, and I remember talking about this with Akim Menges and Philip Yuan years ago, without really having evidence for what I was saying. But I've always believed that computation can tell us more about what it is to be human. And I go back to the example of Craig Reynolds, when he developed these boids to model the flocking behaviors of birds. And until that moment, I don't know how he did it. I don't know how he did it, but you had to kind of reverse engineer it. But anyway, up until that moment, we didn't know how birds would flock, and he devised some rules that seemed to work, and it therefore began to inform the ornithologists or bird experts, whatever they're called, how birds behave. And I strongly feel that what we're discovering now with AI is really how our minds work. And I think what I find at the moment, the kind of confluence between neuroscience and AI, whereby you get neuroscientists like Anil Seth who've trained in AI for their PhD and moving into neuroscience, and others, Denis Sabis, who did a PhD in neuroscience and moved into AI. It's really about the same thing. In other words, one of the comments I make in my book, which I think is a really important one, the quest for AI is the quest for intelligence itself. To my mind, there's no question that is really what we're trying to get to. And above all else, I kind of believe that, and I'm not the first to say this. Others have already said it before. That I mean, including Margaret Bowden, really, that AI can become a kind of mirror in which we can understand what it is to be human and what is human intelligence. So, in some ways, as a theorist, as someone who I'm not sure what a theorist is actually, but as someone who's asking questions the whole time and trying to understand things, AI holds out that possibility that you can really begin to understand how we think. So over and above the kind of the really challenging issue of consciousness, which is raised by AI, because that's the crucial difference between us and AI. AI doesn't have consciousness, and that's a deeply philosophical question. And you can follow David Chalmers and others in that, or you can follow neuroscientists and that. Over and above the question of consciousness, I think it really is helping us to think about how we work as architects. And I mean, again, some of the comments I made in the book and I've made elsewhere, I think, and we can't prove this, but the way that when you reverse the flow of a neural network and you get deep dream, that's interesting, right? Because what we were using neural networks for before was to recognize things, to interpret things in some ways. And then you realize it goes in the other direction. You think, well, hold on a second. Does that mean that kind of creativity is somehow the opposite modality to that? And you can see that with the GANs as well, how one plays off against the other. So I really kind of begin to think that even though you can't prove things, there's something fascinating that's coming out, especially about neural networks. And of course, they're nothing like the neurons in a brain, but somehow there's something really intriguing about how well they work. And we don't know how the brain works, but nor do we know how deep the deep layers of a neural network work. But there's something interesting there that's beginning to open up questions which I think are really fascinating. And I'm convinced that we're on the cusp of a really interesting moment beyond architecture in terms of understanding what it is to be human. And I'm convinced it's going to come out of those things. I think the challenge of, I don't know, GPT-3 and so on is really, I mean, it's kind of, in a way, it's sort of faking it, but aren't we faking it? And so there are really interesting kind of questions thrown up, which I think are going to have a profound impact on understanding what it is to be human. So, as a theorist, I just kind of think, well, I haven't got time in the day to write enough about what I'm thinking about. All these ideas are coming up, but it's really an exciting moment. I think it's an exciting moment for theorists, for philosophers, for neuroscientists, for AI experts, and it's an exciting moment for architects because we're beginning to revitalize architecture in exactly the way that Wolf Pricks and Zaha Hadid and all those people revitalized architecture about 20 years ago or so, and that makes it a fascinating time to be part of architecture. So that, alongside the kind of the democratization, I think, of the discourse that we're seeing, makes it really special, especially to be from places. I mean, India has access, but then think of other countries that don't have access, less access. It's great because now it's opening up in a very positive way. So I'm really optimistic. I think something new is happening, and it's incredibly exciting. And AI is fundamentally part of it, and especially for your generation. I mean, my students, I was amazed when they, for their theory essays, and about 90%, 95% write about AI. It's their world. It's their world. They understand it in a way their parents don't understand it. It's the social media apps. It's absolutely, that's the world in which they operate, and that's going to be the nature of the future. So it's an absolutely exciting time. A really exciting time. So
Yes.
I've just been invited to another talk. This is what my day is like. Okay, I'm talking to someone. I think you're in Chicago, but it could be India. I'm talking to someone in China and someone in Australia. So these things are kind of, anyway. So I have to go. I've got to call it a day here. But thank you for what you're doing. I think you're helping to disseminate these things. We can't do it all on our own. We rely on guys like you to push these messages out there. Tell everyone in India to listen to Digital Futures. Tell them to watch the DDES things that they're happening the whole time, and they're for them. It's really for them. The reason why we're live streaming this is to get it out there. I think no one owns ideas; they're to be shared. So anyway,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thanks a lot, Neil, and I really appreciate you have a meeting. So it means a lot.